everyone, and welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on MIP voids and reversals. Today we have Kathy Dwyer, a Senior Application Consultant here at Zobrio to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over all questions at the end. Thank you, and I hand it back over to Kathy.
Alrighty, thanks, Colleen, and welcome all. This morning we are going to review one of the more frequently asked questions in the MIP software, and that relates to voiding checks. And really, when you think about voiding checks, there's really two things you got to think about. You know, is it just the check itself you want to void so that you can reissue another check for the invoice that was paid, or is the intention to basically void the check as well as reverse the invoice so that it's wiped out completely? And essentially the bottom line is you void the check, you're putting money back into the cash account, you're voiding the invoice, or I should call it reverse the invoice. What you're doing there is you're putting a credit back against the expense of perhaps the liability account. But to get started, what ends up happening is you want to go up under activities, and under activities there's check writing, and as you come across there is void checks, vouchers, and invoices. Also note that if you do have your accounts payable, if you will, graphic in the background, notice to the bottom of my screen under related tasks, to the top column on the right, there is also a void checks and payments, which essentially is the same thing. Okay, so you have kind of, I like to call it a hot link here through related tasks, or follow the path of activities, check writing, and void checks. And like all jobs that require a session, you're doing some type of entry, we start with a session ID. I'm going to hit my plus sign, and I've got my automatic session assignments. In this case, the VCK is short for void check. We specify the status. We'll do a batch to post. And what I'm going to do here basically is just, I'm going to just say void, keep it simple. As we know, descriptions aren't required. I do recommend them. They simply make it easier when you're looking to post to make sure that you're pulling the correct or posting the correct sessions. The first date you see there is essentially what it is it's the calendar date. It's the day you're making the void in the system. Okay? But the big decision really comes down to is this checkbox on the left to whether to use the original effective date. And what that means is when you void the check, and let's say the check was issued on July 1st, the reversal or the void of that check will also be on July 1st. Okay? If you prefer to make that check void effective on a different date, obviously, you'll just leave that box unchecked and specify the new effective date. That might relate to as far as, you might have a month that's reconciled cash-wise, and then you find out that a check needs to be voided. You might void that with a current date so as not to impact your cash reconciliation from a period that is, if you will, soft closed. Okay. So we're going to hit the Start button. Now, what MIP does is it does automatically put a filter in this job. As you'll notice in the upper right-hand side, it automatically puts in a date filter greater than, I thought that was 6 months, but that looks a little bit more than 6 months. But basically what it does, the filter's there because depending on the size of your organization, you could have thousands and thousands of checks, or quite a few anyhow, and it might take the grid area a substantial amount of time to load. But by putting in a filter, it basically gets you up and running right away. Certainly you can scroll through this list looking for your entry. I tend to come up and remove that filter, and you can either filter on the vendor ID, but I prefer document, which is the check number. Okay? So if we move move our filter left to right and we go ahead and filter, I'm going to filter on a particular check number that I know that's out there. Okay, so give me that document or check number, hit the magnifying glass to display, and what it will do is bring up that one entry, just a single check. That way I'm not necessarily scrolling through a whole slosh. I know I'm getting exactly what I want. Now what happens here is this, is on the left side of the screen, if you put a check mark in that box, what it's saying is, okay, that's the check, I want to reverse it. If you follow across the screen horizontally, you'll notice that there is also a box there that's lit up that says reverse invoice. Okay. That box will light up and allow me to put a check mark in it as long as you don't see anything in the next column over that says reverse restriction. Okay. When there is a restriction, and we'll go over those in our next example, but when there is a restriction, it doesn't allow you to reverse the invoice at the same time you're voiding the check. It actually becomes a two-step process. But here in this example, what we're saying is void the check, reverse the invoice, because maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe we paid the wrong vendor. We just want the whole thing to go away. So again, what it will indeed do is come back and debit your cash account and credit, I'll say the expense account. So what we'll do, we got the two check marks. We're going to hit OK. Okay. The system just goes through, tells us what it's doing, and we can hit the finish box. Now, the thing to note and to remember to do is, because we set this up as a batch to post, always go to your post transactions. And what makes this void example unique is, notice in this grid area, the session ID, the session date, the session description, they're all equivalent. And what makes these records unique is the first column, which is the transaction source. And what ends up happening is transaction source, accounts payable invoice, that's the reversal of the invoice. APV is the accounts payable void, meaning it's the check originated from the AP module, and they go together. Watch what happens here is if I put a check mark in the first box, we get this pop-up message that just basically says, you know what, those two are a pair, they have to be posted together. To be honest with you, I think it's a tad bit weird. It doesn't give me a chance to check them both, but nevertheless, it tells us, it checks it automatically, and then what we do is we go ahead and post that entry. Okay. Now, of course, let me just open up post just to show you. Oh, they're gone. Okay, so they've been posted. Now, let's take a look at what that does. How do we know exactly what just occurred? Well, let me go into vendor balances down here under related tasks. Okay. You could also get to vendor balances by going to activities, accounts payable, and display vendor balances. Okay. You might even have a shortcut up under your favorites. But that particular check was for a vendor called vendor ID called Trans. Okay. And what I do is I have my date range that fell within, and the lookup from is all activity. I'm going to go ahead and display that. And the check that just voided was the one on the very bottom. That document number is basically the invoice number. But let me expand it just to show you what happens in the case of a void and a reversal. Is when you read the horizontal lines for the darker blue color, that first column, transaction type, we got an API, which is the invoice. You read across, and it's got an amount. Second line, APC. In this example, the APC, it's basically a check that was paid through the general ledger, as opposed to probably in most instances you're going to see APS for meaning an accounts payable system-generated check. That comes in as a negative amount. The third line down is the invoice, as a negative amount, so it's reversing the invoice. So it went in as an API, it came out as an API. And then, of course, the fourth record down is the void of the check. So the combination of all the ins and the outs, or the pluses and minuses, negate to zero. And really, in this instance, what it did is it completely eliminated not only the check, but by reversing the invoice, it's gone. It no longer hasn't. It's not open anywhere. It's done. It's tucked away. It's taken care of. Now, there is another example where if we come back up here, and I'll come in the same way. They tend to be a little old-fashioned and use the top-down. But I want to come back in and ask for another session. This is another example that we're going to do here, which basically we're going to void the check, but we're not going to reverse the invoice. Now, I'll get a new session, okay, and I'll be a little bit more wordy here. Okay. I take the original date, okay, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and start it up. So we got our session information, start it up. We do have our automatic filter, which again, sometimes it's valid. You know, you can go ahead and use that and just scroll up and down and find your entry. I'm going to take that away, and in this instance, I'm going to basically filter on the vendor ID called trans. Get my display records icon. And the reason I wanted to do that, go after a vendor as opposed to a specific check number, it's just to illustrate something we alluded to a little bit earlier, is notice the records down the bottom in the reverse restriction column is saying multiple invoices. What ends up happening here is if I want to go ahead and delete, or let's say take that record right there, the 30362, and let's say I want to void that check, I might even want to reverse the invoice, but notice as we come across the reverse invoice box, checkbox does not have focus. And so I can try to check it, but nothing's going to happen. And the reason behind that is because we have a reverse restriction. The system purposely says things like if you have multiple invoices, if you have an appended invoice, if you have partial payments, maybe no invoice at all is another example. What ends up happening is those are where, when you see that restriction, it says to me, no, can't reverse it. It ends up being a two-step process if indeed you want to avoid the check and reverse the invoice. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and do what we can. Hit the check box to void the check. Give it the OK. No error messages, so we'll finish up. And this time when we go to post, okay, because we only have a voided check, no invoice reversal, we simply have one record here in the grid that we select and we post. Now, let's do this again. Let's go back to vendor balances just to take a look at that, okay, and just so you can see what this does. I'm going to go after the same vendor, ID trans. Let me give you an example of changing why the lookup from. I'm going to ask for just open invoices, okay, and I'm going to go ahead and display. And obviously, I have a bad date range. Let me open this up to some of this data gets a tad bit old. Let me see if I get that good. There we go. So what happens here is this entry, you'll notice in basically either on the grid, the last column on the right shows an outstanding balance. Okay, there are two entries. The two entries together total the $490.22, which is the check I voided. But here's an example. Why couldn't we reverse the invoice at the same time? Well, we had multiple invoices that make up that check. So what you'll see here, and this is just for me to show you what's going on, is the O API under the lookup from is basically show me just my open invoices. And by having an outstanding balance, whether it's in the grid or the lower part of the right-hand side of the screen, you can see open amounts. Let me drill into one of these. Okay? What you'll see now in looking at the darker blue stripes, we've got an API, we got our invoice. The second line down, APS, is our check. Okay? And then the third line down is the void of that check. But what we still have is we haven't resolved what we want to do with that invoice. Okay? Now, what I will say is this: there's two options that you have at this point. You might simply want to reissue a check for that invoice. Maybe the vendor lost the original check and you've maybe called the bank and canceled it and you want to reissue it. You certainly can do that. You don't need to do anything further as far as reversals. But you may want to reverse it. Okay? Now, if you do want to reverse it, what you have to make note of here is you really need to know what was the original session number that the invoice went in on. And the quickest way to find that is through this vendor display balances and drilling in. And as you can see there, we've got that session ID. Okay? We also have the various document numbers. And the document numbers, it's kind of a generic column. If you're looking at an invoice line, the document number is the invoice number. If you're looking at an APS line, which a check, the document number is a check number. Okay? So in this instance, what we really need to know is if we want to get rid of this invoice is the session ID, the document number, and of course it's nice to know what the amount of money is as well. So let's do this. Let me close out of this inquiry for a second and just mention to you this is, if we don't go back and reverse that invoice, okay, what ends up happening is when we go into the select to pay, okay, those invoices are going to be here. They're down here. Let me check them off. They're under that vendor trans. Okay. So you'll notice when I check the 2 off and we look at the total at the bottom of the screen, that's the check that we voided, the $490.22. Okay. So what happens is voiding an invoice, voiding a check without reversing the invoice, puts the invoice back in, it's available to be selected for pay, which certainly if you want to reissue the check, just select those lines and move forward as normal. Select the pay and then pay. But if those invoices are hanging there and you really want to get rid of them, this is what you do in that instance. Okay? Is what you do is you go up to Enter Invoices, get yourself a new session. Again, I encourage, if you can, put in a description. This date, again, here that you see is really just intended to be the system date of when the work was being done, literally posted into the system. We hit the Start button. Okay? And the important thing here to remember is you don't want to put in an invoice number. Okay? And if you add an invoice, it implies you're going to change something that's unposted or you're adding something brand new. Okay? Rather, what you do is this icon up at the top, the 2 pieces of paper with the red arrow, as we can see, it says Reverse Posted Document. When you click on that, the system's going to bring up a dialog box. Okay? And this is where it wants to know what was the original session number of the transaction that you're reversing. And again, you might say, I don't know. Remember, go back to your display balances, drill into what you're looking for, and it will give you that session number. Okay? And of course, there also is a drop-down here. But, sometimes drop lists can be very helpful, or they can be very expansive depending on the number of records behind it. Okay? So in this instance, we're selecting the original session number, okay? And then we can either enter or hit the drop arrow to select the document. Keep in mind, within this screen, you can double-click. Sometimes I'll do that. I double-click the amount field to put us in numeric order, by amount. And what ends up happening is that's one of the invoices that 24269. Okay. I tend, again, to allow it to default to use the original document date, use the original effective date. Okay. I always say it is important. Let me go ahead and hit OK so we can see what that looks like. Okay. When this comes up, and this is a message about 1099s. It's again, the data is a little bit old, so we're going to ignore that for a moment. It's really what it's saying is, notice in the middle of the screen, miscellaneous 07 on the 1099. What it's trying to tell us is that's no longer a valid 1099 box. It's changed over to NEC01. But what we're really looking for is, from a void or a reversal standpoint for this invoice, is notice the upper right, the amount is a negative. Notice in the grid area, that first line is the GL expense account. Okay, that's credited, so that's normally, of course, it goes in as a debit. It's reversing it with its offset to the accounts payable account. Okay. It is important, you know, you can control the effective date on the right-hand side of that screen. However, it is important, don't change anything else, okay, because the invoice went in a certain way and you want to reverse it identical. Okay. Yes, you can say it went in June and we're reversing it in July, or maybe better saying September and October, but don't change your GL numbers, don't change the vendor, just go ahead and say, yeah, go ahead and do the reversal. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And again, it's a little bit stale data. It's just telling me I'm impacting a prior fiscal year. Now, in our example, we had 2 invoices to reverse, so I'm going to do it in the same session. I'm just going to come back up to the reverse icon. I'm going to go ahead, in my instance, I'm going to go ahead and key back in the original session number. And what ends up happening is, let me go ahead and hit the drop down, because again, just to kind of show you, double click that. I believe the other one was 289.30. There we go. So what we'll do here is this, leave all the information identical, use the original dates. And if I have any question as far as did you get the right record, you know, the reversal entry will show you the vendor. It will show you the detail, of course. And same thing, invoice amount is negative, the expense account is being credited. Okay. And we'll go ahead and do the save. Okay. And again, apologize for some of these pop-up messages. Okay. We're going to go ahead and close. We'll go ahead and post those transactions. Okay, our invoice reversal. And again, just to kind of look at this, if we come back to select invoices to pay, and I'll grab a session that's just kind of hanging out there, start her up. Okay. Again, that was vendor trans, T-R-A-N-S. Notice it's gone. Okay. Once we reverse those invoices, they're no longer available to be selected for pay because the plus and the minus invoice negate one another. Now, let's talk about this. This might be obvious to everybody, but let me just mention this a bit, is under reports and down to the second item where it says check and voucher register, you can basically set up, like in my example, I have a void check report. Okay. And really all I really did is I took one of these other reports and copied it, which is this icon in the upper left. Okay. And the big thing about a void check register is certainly you can control the date range for whatever you're looking for. The filter is what becomes significant. Okay. Transaction source on a void is either you might see it as an APV or a VCK. So what's happening here is our filter in the upper right, it's in means I'm going to create a list of what we're looking for. Separated, each value is separated by a comma. And really, probably the best way I can tell you is the difference between an APV and a VCK means the source of where the check came from. So APV means it originated in the accounts payable module and it was printed there. On the other hand, VCK, the general ledger has the ability, this something called a cash disbursement record, and I'll show you the screen here in just a second. So you can literally post disbursements directly to your general ledger. Maybe they were checks that you've written, handwritten offline. But there's also a functionality in the general ledger where you can enter the invoice, print a check, enter an invoice, print a check. So essentially you're bypassing the AP module. But what happens is with the filter, by looking for just void transactions, that's what gives us our, of course, what we call void checks. The content tab, as we know, you can control page breaks. I don't like that. Let me get rid of that GL code as a page break. But GL code on a page break is significant if you have multiple cash accounts. Your report can do a page break per, if you will, essentially cash account. But I've included in the right grid, lower right-hand side, the different fields that I'm looking for. And if I go ahead and display this up to the screen, what we'll see here is the different entries. And specifically, if we focus in on the bottom one, that was one of our void checks. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth one from the bottom, that transportation services, that was our other voided check. So the reporting, you can isolate just your voids, and again, that comes through the filtering. No filter means you're going to get all checks and voids. Filtering gives you just what you're looking for. Finally, what I just want to say to you, this too is something that to keep in mind too is up under activities into check writing. Okay, this is where we came across and selected voids, checks, vouchers, which are anything paid through an EFT, and invoices, of course. But notice just below that, there's also a cancel function too. So if you happen to maybe void a check, and it was like, oh, shoot, I got the wrong one, that cancel void checks and invoices there will let you go back and, in essence, reverse a void. So that's out there. It's either through the activities or, again, always keep in mind sometimes these related tasks get overlooked, but they're quick links. Instead of having to drill in and say, where was that? It's right down here under related tasks. Alrighty, so basically that is the subject area we wanted to cover this morning. I hope that answers some of the questions that you folks have. Always feel free to reach out to me if you want to drill in further and discuss this more. My email address is Kathy with a K .Dwyer, DWYER, @Zobrio.com. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day, and we'll talk, hopefully, I'll see you all on next month's Zobrio University.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be made available shortly.